Greetings, mortals. Tonight we explore a man who thought he was Satan. He called himself Pazuzu Algarad, borrowing the name of a demon, carving his own teeth into points, covering his skin in symbols. To some, he was a leader. To others, a warning. The house filled with stories of rules that made no sense, nights that never ended, and a smell that rolled out into the street.
Clemens, North Carolina. A commuter town folded into the larger shadow of Winston-Salem. Streets here end in cul-de-sacs, edged by chain-link fences and trimmed hedges. Mailboxes tilt the same way from decades of wind. Driveways hold cars with the same layer of pine dust. It's the kind of place where differences don't announce themselves loudly, except for one house. From the road, house number omitted, seemed abandoned. Blinds drawn, windows covered with plywood, graffiti sprayed across siding in crude symbols. The yard was a sprawl of weeds. The smell, when the wind shifted, was sour and unmistakable. Neighbors learned to keep their distance. At night, the place changed. Cars pulled into the driveway at all hours. Music thumped, then cut out. Sometimes there were screams. Not playful, not drunk, the kind that froze people mid-step. No one stayed long on the sidewalk. Inside lived John Alexander Lawson. Born in San Francisco in 1978, raised in scattered towns before landing in Forsyth County, he grew into adulthood under the radar. Those who knew him in his early years recall a thin, quiet boy, anxious, withdrawn, dogged by depression. He drifted through high school, collecting piercings and tattoos the way other kids collected yearbook signatures. In 2002, he changed his name legally to Pazuzu Algarad. The choice was deliberate. Pazuzu, the Mesopotamian demon of famine and locusts, lifted into pop culture by the Exorcist. Algarad, an invented surname with an occult edge. With the new name came an image overhaul. Filed teeth, blackened eyes and photos, a body becoming a gallery of inverted crosses and jagged lines. He began telling people he had supernatural origins, that he could control spirits, that blood rituals gave him strength. But this wasn't the late 80s satanic panic of talk shows and church basements. The truth was more grounded and more dangerous. Lawson, Pazuzu, operated in a space where charisma met addiction. Meth was cheap and plentiful. Heroin moved in familiar channels. He offered both. Around him gathered the lonely, the addicted, the alienated. People in need of shelter, people in need of a fix. People looking for a place where nothing was off limits. The house became a magnet, and once drawn in, people rarely left clean. Neighbors phoned in noise complaints, suspected drug activity, and worse. Patrol cars came and went. The reports piled up in police files, thin details on thick stacks of paper. There was rarely enough for charges to stick. Behind the boarded windows, life turned inward. Sunlight barely reached the rooms. A mattress lay directly on the living room floor, surrounded by ashtrays and bottles. Walls filled with black spray paint, pentagrams, slurs, sigils invented on the spot. People crashed on couches, on bare carpet, in hallways. Money moved in folded bills or bags of powder. Arguments erupted, then dissolved in smoke. To outsiders, it was a nuisance property, loud, smelly, and strange. To the people inside, it was a world with its own gravity. Pazuzu encouraged transgression. He told followers there were no rules, then enforced the ones he invented. Bathing was discouraged. Staying sober was mocked. Rituals, real or performed, served as loyalty tests. and over time, the cul-de-sac adapted. Neighbors stopped making eye contact when they drove past. Children were told to take the long way to school. The house stood sealed from the daylight, as if waiting for the next thing to be drawn inside. This is where the story begins, in a quiet North Carolina suburb, with a single home no one wanted to enter, and a man who made sure of it. John Alexander Lawson was not born in Clemens. His early life drifted across states, California, then the Carolinas, marked by frequent moves, interrupted schooling, and what friends later described as a sense of rootlessness. Classmates remembered a boy who preferred corners to crowds, who could vanish from a conversation without anyone noticing until much later. By adolescence, depression and anxiety were constants. There were brushes with counseling, but nothing that took hold. He gravitated toward the margins, music with darker edges, films heavy with occult imagery, the kind of thrift store clothes that telegraph separation from the rest of the cafeteria. Isolation deepened. He discovered the methamphetamine scene, first on its fringes, then immersed. Meth didn't just give him energy, it rewired his days. Sleep lost meaning. So did routine. Addiction doesn't happen in an instant, but there's always a moment when it becomes the primary orbit. For Lawson, that moment was already past by the time most people noticed. The transformation began in the early 2000s. In 2002, he filed the paperwork to shed his birth name and adopt Pazuzu Algarad. The first name came from the Mesopotamian demon of plague and drought, infamous among horror fans for its fictional role in The Exorcist. The middle and last were self-invented, stitched from syllables to sound ancient. The change was legal, but its purpose was theatrical, a public rebirth. Physical changes followed. His teeth were filed into points, uneven and jagged. Tattoos multiplied, covering arms, neck, and face. Black ink carved crude patterns and occult symbols across skin like graffiti over walls. In interviews years later, he claimed to avoid bathing for months at a time, believing it connected him more deeply to natural instincts. Whether or not this was true, the claim became part of his persona. The image he built was more than appearance. It was performance. He began telling people he could speak to spirits, that he could control the elements, that his rituals could change a person forever. The truth was less mystical. He could provide drugs, and he could offer a place where nothing was off limits. That was enough to draw in the curious and the desperate alike. By the mid-2000s, social media became another stage. On MySpace, and later Facebook, Pazuzu curated a feed of violent iconography, occult references, and confrontational status updates. He posed with weapons. He posted photos in black eyeliner, teeth bared, surrounded by friends flashing devil horn gestures. For people already on the margins, his profile was an invitation. Here was someone unashamed of being outside the rules. Offline, the house in Clemens became the embodiment of his online presence. Guests were greeted with rules that were less about order and more about disorientation. Bathing was discouraged, framed as freeing oneself from societal norms. Rituals involving blood, fire, or weapons were staged in the living room. The house was always open to those who pledged loyalty. It was a controlled chaos. Pazuzu positioned himself as the axis. Access to drugs, to shelter, and to the group's sense of belonging depended on proximity to him. He amplified paranoia about outsiders, especially law enforcement. He encouraged the idea that leaving the group was a betrayal. The effect was classic coercive control. Members were isolated from family, cut off from outside support, and bonded to each other through shared transgression. What outsiders saw as filth and danger, insiders experienced as proof of their separation from the normal world. At times, the theatricality bled into genuine pathology. Friends recalled his temper, sudden, unpredictable, and his ability to turn affection into humiliation without warning. Violence was a currency, so was fear. But the mask wasn't always seamless. In quieter moments, some saw the man underneath, the anxiety, the aimless pacing, the shadow of someone who once wanted to be more than the role he'd written for himself. Others say they never saw anything human in him at all. In truth, the performance and the person had fused. By then, there was no clear line. Through the late 2000s, the house's reputation grew. It was a place where meth flowed, where strangers came and went, where nights bled into mornings without pause. It was also a place where loyalties were tested in ways designed to erode boundaries. Stories circulated, some true, some exaggerated, about what happened inside. The man who called himself Pazuzu cultivated these rumors. They added weight to his myth. The darker the story, the more people were willing to believe he was capable of anything. And the more believable he became, the easier it was for him to keep the people around him exactly where he wanted them. By the time police reports began to stack up, noise complaints, suspected assaults, drug tips, the image was complete. In the eyes of his followers, he wasn't just a man in a house. He was the house. He was the orbit they all moved within, even as the gravity pulled them towards something they couldn't yet see. The house in Clemens was more than an address. It was a living thing. From the curb, its boarded windows gave it the look of an abandoned property. But up close, the boards weren't neat. They were nailed in at angles, leaving gaps for shadows to move behind. Spray painted across the siding were symbols that looked occult to some, random to others, inverted crosses, crude pentagrams, letters that didn't form words. The smell was the first thing anyone noticed. It rolled out the front door when it opened, thick and sour, heavy enough to stick in clothing. Inside it was everywhere, in the carpet fibers, in the curtains, in the layers of trash that mounded in corners. The walls were a collage of black spray paint and Sharpie ink, slurs, jagged phrases, and invented sigils drawn over one another until the original paint disappeared. In some rooms, light bulbs had been removed entirely. Others glowed dim from bare fixtures caked in dust. Furniture was scavenged, broken, or absent altogether. Mattresses without sheets sat directly on stained floors. Counters were buried in bottles, ashtrays, and food containers long past rotting. The oven door was warped and blackened. The refrigerator hummed weakly, stocked with little that could be eaten. Animal bones, some small enough to be from rodents, others larger, were scattered on the floor or arranged in crude displays. Whether these were trophies, ritual props, or simple neglect was never clear. The air was warm, damp, and still. Curtains, when they existed, stayed drawn. Daylight was an intruder. This was the setting Pazuzu offered to anyone who needed a place to crash, or anyone who could bring something to trade. Meth was the most common currency, but alcohol, cigarettes, and loyalty counted too. The door was rarely locked. Strangers drifted in and out at all hours. There was an unspoken hierarchy. New arrivals were watched, tested. Some were asked to take part in rituals, staged or real, as a sign of commitment. Others were pushed to break taboos, small at first, then escalating. The more a person crossed those lines, the deeper they belonged. Neighbors noticed. Some called 911 after hearing fights spill into the yard or seeing visitors stagger into the street. Others complained about the smell, about the piles of trash visible through gaps in the plywood. Police responded more than once. Officers wrote reports, issued warnings, but without a clear prosecutable crime in front of them, the visits ended with no arrests. For the people inside, police visits only reinforced the house's mythology. They became part of the story Pazuzu told his circle, a narrative of persecution by outsiders, proof that they were different and untouchable. Over time, the house became a closed system. Those who left often came back, drawn by the same pull that had kept them there before. For some, it was the drugs. For others, the feeling of belonging, however toxic. The dirt, the smell, the darkness, these became normal, almost invisible to the people who lived there. For outsiders who entered, the shock was immediate. One visitor later described it as stepping into a place where every rule of living had been reversed. Cleanliness, order, privacy, none applied. The house didn't just look abandoned. It felt like it had abandoned the idea of being a home. This was the gravity Pazuzu created. It didn't rely on chains or locked doors. It relied on erosion, of boundaries, of health, of self-respect, until leaving seemed harder than staying. From the street, the house was silent more often than not. The plywood over the windows kept whatever happened inside from spilling into the daylight, but the smell still made its way out, and sometimes, so did the screams. Joshua Wetzler was 37 when he disappeared. He had grown up in rural North Carolina, working with his hands, fixing motorcycles, trading in old cars. Friends described him as easygoing, quick to laugh, and restless in a way that kept him moving between jobs. In his mid-30s, he was rebuilding. He had a young son. He had made mistakes, brushes with drugs, a stint in jail, but was trying to line things up again. Tommy Welch was 31. He came from a close family and carried himself with a quiet confidence. He was a welder by trade, proud of his work. Like Joshua, he sometimes slipped into circles where meth and alcohol blurred the edges of the day. But to those who knew him, he was steady, someone you could call at midnight if your car broke down. Neither man lived in Clemens. Neither had deep ties to the house on the cul-de-sac. But both, in different moments, crossed its threshold. By 2009, Wetzler had been spending time with people connected to Pazuzu's orbit. It was easy to drift in. The offer of a drink, a place to crash, someone who claimed to understand being on the outside. In summer, he stopped returning calls from his girlfriend. A week became a month. She filed a missing person report in late July. Welch's path crossed with the house in 2009 as well. Accounts differ on whether he went there looking for a party, a deal, or simply to see someone he knew. What's consistent is that after he entered, no one outside the group saw him again. During this period, the house's state had deteriorated even further. Trash covered the floors in every room. Food containers rotted where they'd been dropped. Beer cans formed small towers along the baseboards. The smell of human waste mixed with animal remains. Feces smeared in corners and hallways, sometimes tracked across the floors. The air was thick enough to turn a visitor's stomach. Inside, it was simply part of the landscape. Rumors began to circulate about what had happened to the two men. Some whispered they'd been killed and buried in the backyard. Others said they'd skipped town. Within the house, people spoke in half-jokes about rites and offerings, language that blurred the line between performance and confession. Witnesses later told police they had been threatened into silence. One said Pazuzu hinted that anyone who talked would end up in the ground themselves. Another claimed Amber Birch, his girlfriend and co-defendant, repeated the warning with a smile. Years passed. The missing persons files for Wetzler and Welch stayed open but stagnant. Leads thinned. The house remained active. Cars coming and going at odd hours, occasional police visits that resulted in nothing more than citations. For neighbors, it became background noise, something you notice less the longer it's there. In 2014, a tip reached law enforcement. It wasn't the first, but this one was specific enough to secure a search warrant. On October 5th, Forsyth County deputies and crime scene investigators arrived at the house. They began in the backyard. The soil was uneven in spots, bare where grass refused to grow. Under one patch, they uncovered skeletal remains. A second set lay buried nearby. The site was cordoned off. The dig continued for days. Dental records confirmed the identities: Joshua Wetzler and Tommy Welch. Both had died from gunshot wounds. The remains were incomplete, weathered by years underground. The medical examiner worked within those limits, the reports clinical and restrained. Pazuzu Algarad and Amber Birch were arrested the same day. Birch faced charges in the deaths of both men. A third person, Crystal Matlock, was later charged as an accessory after the fact for helping bury Welch. News of the discovery broke fast. Local stations ran aerial shots of the house, police tents in the yard, deputies carrying evidence bags. In interviews, family members spoke in careful phrases, grief under tension. Wetzler's girlfriend described the years of uncertainty as a slow-motion nightmare. Welch's mother, in a voice barely above a whisper, said she'd always known something was wrong but couldn't make anyone listen. The families learned the details in fragments, much of it filtered through court filings. They did not attend every hearing. Some stayed away entirely, unwilling to share space with the defendants. When Pazuzu was led into the courtroom for his first appearance, his face carried the same tattoos and sharpened teeth that had made him a local curiosity. He smiled at the cameras. The performance had not stopped. Amber Birch kept her head down, her hair falling over her face. She spoke softly, her voice barely carrying to the microphones. For law enforcement, the discovery closed 2 cases but left a larger question unanswered. How had it taken 5 years for anyone to act on the rumors? How had it taken 5 years for anyone to act on the rumors? Neighbors and acquaintances had called in complaints. Friends had hinted at violence. Yet without someone willing to give a sworn statement, without physical evidence, the case had been left to wait. The house in Clemens was now a crime scene. It would not be lived in again. Amber Birch met Pazuzu in the late 2000s. She was younger, searching for stability, and already entangled in her own substance use. Within weeks, she was living in the Clemens house. Friends noticed the change. Her social life narrowed, her appearance shifted, and her contact with family thinned. Birch became more than a partner. She was his enforcer. When Pazuzu made a rule, she helped see it carried out. When someone challenged him, she reinforced his authority, sometimes with words, sometimes with force. In the years to come, witnesses would place her at the center of the violence, not just as a participant, but as someone who embraced it. The pair's relationship functioned like an addiction loop. Each fed the other's worst impulses. Meth binges blurred days into nights. Paranoia amplified intimacy into obsession. Jealousy, isolation, and loyalty became indistinguishable. Leaving wasn't considered. Around them gathered a rotating cast of followers and hangers-on. Some stayed for days, others for months. Many arrived in moments of personal collapse, recently evicted, unemployed, estranged from family. The house offered an immediate, if unstable, shelter, but entry had a price: drugs, obedience, and a willingness to take part in whatever was unfolding inside. Group dynamics followed a familiar pattern. Outsiders became insiders by crossing lines. The first might be small, using drugs in front of the group, breaking something for amusement, telling a secret they'd never told before. The next would be larger and irreversible. Each step deepened their investment in the group, making it harder to walk away. Pazuzu cultivated dependency through scarcity. He controlled access to drugs, to places to sleep, even to the emotional approval of the group. Someone who defied him might find themselves locked out of the house, cut off from the only consistent shelter they had. For people already on the edge, that was enough to keep them in line. Fear played a role too. There were stories about what happened to people who left and talked. Threats didn't need to be repeated often. They lingered in the air, reinforced by glances, by the occasional sudden burst of violence. Inside the group, rituals and strange rules bonded members. They were not elaborate or even consistent, sometimes nothing more than sitting in a circle while candles burned or passing around a blade as a prop. The point was less about belief and more about performance, about signaling loyalty in a language outsiders wouldn't understand. For those deep inside, the filth, the smell, the chaos were not deterrents. They became part of the identity. To live there was to reject the norms of the outside world, to prove you could endure what others couldn't. That endurance was a badge of belonging. Witnesses later gave conflicting accounts. Some remembered moments of almost normal interaction, watching movies, eating takeout, talking about music. Others recalled a constant edge of threat, where any joke could turn into an accusation. Meth blurred memories and time. Not all contradictions could be resolved. What was consistent was the gravity of the house. People spoke of trying to leave and then returning days later, pulled back without clear reason. For some, it was addiction. For others, the sense that however dangerous, this was still a place where they were seen. Codependency worked in both directions. Pazuzu relied on his circle to sustain his image, to keep the performance alive. Without an audience, the persona risked collapse. His followers, in turn, relied on him to maintain the fragile world they'd built together. A world cut off from daylight, from rules, from the quiet scrutiny of neighbors. It was a closed loop, and breaking it would require something from outside. October 5th, 2014. Deputies in Forsyth County executed their search warrant. By the end of the day, the backyard had yielded 2 shallow graves. The next morning, the names of Joshua Wetzler and Tommy Welch were confirmed. Pazuzu Algarad and Amber Birch were taken into custody without incident. The house was sealed as a crime scene. Evidence technicians worked room by room, photographing the graffiti, the piles of trash, the bones scattered inside. The odor that had carried into the street for years was now a documented fact in official reports. Birch was charged with second-degree murder in the deaths of both men. Algarad faced the same charges, plus accessory after the fact for helping bury them. A third arrest came later. Crystal Matlock, charged as an accessory in Welch's burial. Court appearances were brief but closely watched. Algarad appeared with his hair matted, his tattoos stark under the courtroom lights. He smiled at the cameras, speaking only when addressed. The teeth, the name, the persona were intact. Birch said little. Her voice was low, her answers short. When the charges were read, she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. In October 2015, while awaiting trial, Algarad was found dead in his cell at Central Prison in Raleigh. The Department of Public Safety classified it as a suicide. No method was released publicly. The statement was clinical, the details minimal. Birch eventually entered an Alford plea, not admitting guilt, but acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict. She was sentenced to a term that will keep her in prison for decades. Matlock pleaded guilty to her charge and served less than 3 years. The house stood empty for months after the arrests. The plywood remained over the windows. Evidence tape crisscrossed the doors. By the time the property was released, it had become a point of dark curiosity. People drove past to look, some slowing to take photographs. In April 2015, Forsyth County condemned the structure. That fall, a demolition crew arrived. The process took less than a day. The excavator's arm tore through the roof. Dust and splinters filled the air, drifting over the yard. By sunset, the house was gone, reduced to a flat lot with scattered debris. For some neighbors, it was a relief. For the families of Wetzler and Welch, it was a mixed symbol. The physical place erased, but the loss untouched. No demolition could remove the years between disappearance and discovery. The property remains vacant. Grass grows where the living room once stood. From the street, there is nothing to suggest what happened there, except for the way some drivers still slow as they pass. For law enforcement, the case is closed. For those connected to it, closure is harder to name. In Clemens, the story of Pazuzu Algarad shifted almost immediately from fact to folklore. The bare lot where the house once stood became a landmark. Teenagers drove past at night, daring each other to stop. Some swore they could smell the house even after it was gone. Online, the image spread faster. Old photographs from MySpace and Facebook reappeared, framed by captions that blurred truth and rumor. Posts claimed he'd committed dozens of murders. Others insisted he was a cult leader with hundreds of followers. Most of it was unverified, speculation layered over incomplete facts. Part of the appeal for those sharing the story was the shock value. The name, the filed teeth, the graffiti-covered walls. They made for compelling thumbnails. The true details of Joshua Wetzler's and Tommy Welch's lives, and the years their families spent searching for answers, often faded into the background. National media picked it up. Vice's documentary series, The Devil You Know, devoted 2 seasons to the case, combining interviews, dramatizations, and archival footage. True crime podcasts followed. Some handled the story with care, centering the victims and explaining the social and economic conditions that allowed the house to persist. Others leaned into the more lurid elements, the occult imagery, the rumors of ritual, repeating the same shorthand that had obscured the real drivers all along. The truth was far less cinematic. This was not the product of ancient curses or supernatural forces. It was the result of untreated mental illness, entrenched addiction, social neglect, and a system that could not or would not intervene until it was too late. Still, the myth endured. Online forums debated whether Pazuzu was genuinely dangerous or simply playing a part until reality caught up to him. Some commenters romanticized the lawlessness of the house, ignoring the squalor and violence. In that way, the tolerance he had relied on in life extended into death. His image kept alive by the same fascination that once drew people to his door. For the families of Wetzler and Welch, the coverage is a double edge. It keeps their names in the public record, but often in service of retelling someone else's legend. Their grief becomes a footnote. Communities metabolize evil by turning it into a story. It gives shape to chaos, but in doing so, the story risks simplifying the truth, sanding down the details that make it harder to watch or harder to share. In Clemens, the erasure is literal. The house is gone, its outline faint in aerial photographs. The danger in telling stories like this lies in the balance between remembering and repeating, between examining the conditions that created a predator and feeding the myth that predator built.
The house is gone now. What remains is an empty lot behind a chain-link fence. Its grass, the same pale green as every other yard on the street. The plywood, the graffiti, the smell, all erased in a single day of demolition. Until next time, mortal, this has been Tapes of the Lost.